I'm Laura Bennett, 33 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the quiet one in my family, the one who tried to keep the peace this summer. I pulled into my parents' driveway for the annual Bennett family reunion. Dressed in my navy blue sheath and a thin layer of resolve in my bag was news I thought might finally earn my father's acknowledgement. But by the end of that night, the only thing I would take away was the truth about where I really stood with them. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever had to stand your ground when it mattered most. I grew up in a white painted colonial on a quiet street in Fairfield, Connecticut, the kind of house that looked like it belonged on a postcard with its wide porch and flawless lawn. Inside, though, the rules were as rigid as the schedule my father kept for work. Charles Bennett believed in discipline results and the family name above all else. At our dinner table, conversation was never casual. It was a ledger of accomplishments weighed and judged. My mother Margaret played her part to perfection, always polished, always ready to host, always defending my father's temper as the cost of his success. Daniel, my older brother by 3 years, fit easily into that world. He stepped into our father's company the summer after college and never looked back. Every deal he closed was met with a clap on the back and a story about how Bennett men get things done. My own achievements, degrees in finance and economics, hard-won promotions at firms where no one knew my last name were acknowledged with polite nods or quickly redirected questions about my personal life. I learned early to measure my words at family gatherings to smooth over tension when my father's voice grew sharp, or when Daniel's jokes cut close to the bone. Even after I moved to the city, working long hours for firms that valued my skill, I still found myself driving home on Sundays for the ritual dinners, half hoping for approval that never came. My mother would introduce me to her friends with a smile that carried the faintest edge. Laura works in finance too, but she's not at her father's firm. Over the years, I told myself I could live with it. I told myself that one day an achievement so significant would force them to see me differently. When an offer came from one of the most respected firms in the country, a position I had built toward for over a decade, I thought maybe that day had arrived. The salary was more than double my current one, the team was exceptional, and the company's ethics matched my own. There was only one complication: sometimes they competed with Bennett Financial for the same clients. For weeks I weighed the decision, knowing my father might see it as crossing a line. In the end, I signed the contract. I told myself the reunion would be the perfect time to share the news in front of our extended family, with no way to ignore or downplay it. I imagined the moment, a brief pause at the long dining table, a rare nod of respect from my father, maybe even a smile. That afternoon, as I stepped into the house and heard the sound of laughter drifting from the patio, I reminded myself that I was no longer the uncertain girl they once knew. What I didn't realize was that before the night was over, that belief and the last fragile thread of my loyalty would be put to the test. I stepped through the wide hallway toward the back patio, the murmur of voices growing louder with each step. The air was warm with the scent of grilled vegetables drifting in from outside, and clusters of relatives stood in easy conversation. My mother was at the center of one group, her hands moving gracefully as she spoke to Aunt Evelyn about the new caterer she had hired for the event. When she spotted me, she gave a quick smile, just enough to be polite, before turning back to finish her story. I moved past them to greet Uncle Robert and Claire, who both asked about my work. Before I could answer in detail, Daniel appeared from behind me, sliding an arm around my shoulders as if we were close. "Still playing with spreadsheets," he said with a grin that made the small group laugh, though it was at my expense. He went on to boast about a major account he had just closed, one that our father was thrilled about. The attention shifted instantly toward him, and I took the chance to slip away, my polite smile fading as I headed for the dining room. My father was by the far end of the patio, telling a story to a circle of uncles and cousins, a tumbler of scotch in hand. When his eyes found me, he gave a brief nod, but didn't pause in his tale. I stood for a moment on the edge of the group, then moved on, taking in the familiar rhythm of the day, the careful greetings, the subtle hierarchies, the way conversations bent naturally toward certain people and away from others. Inside the dining room was set for later, the long mahogany table gleaming under the chandelier. My mother's place cards were arranged with practiced precision, her social order on display. As expected, my seat was near the far end between Cousin Evelyn's husband and our great-aunt Nora, whose hearing had grown so poor she rarely followed the conversation. The head of the table was reserved for my father, with Daniel on his right, and my mother on his left, the inner circle. When dinner was finally called, people drifted in from all corners of the house, the low sound of chairs sliding back from the table, echoing against the hardwood floor. Plates of soup arrived first, and the usual small talk filled the room. There were updates on vacation homes, announcements of college acceptances, and congratulatory murmurs for pregnancies. I listened quietly, waiting for the right pause, the moment when I could speak without forcing my words into someone else's story. That opening came during the main course, the soft clink of cutlery filling the space as people focused on their meals. I set down my fork and looked toward my father. "I have some news I'd like to share," I said clearly enough for the whole table to hear. A few heads turned in my direction. "I've accepted a new position, Senior Financial Strategist at Blackwood Financial." For a breath, there was silence, and I thought I saw a flicker of surprise in a few faces. But then my father's fork hit the plate with a sharp clatter. "Blackwood," he said, his voice low but hard. "That's a competitor." Not directly, I explained, keeping my tone even. "There's some overlap, but the client bases and approach are different." "Different approaches indeed," he said, his face tightening. "They undercut established firms with flashy promises. They're known for transparency and ethical practices," I replied before I could stop myself. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when everyone feels the tension, but no one dares move. "What are you implying about my business?" His words were measured, but the warning in them was clear. "I'm not implying anything about your work," I said. "I'm talking about mine, about an opportunity I've earned without family connections. I'd appreciate it if you could say congratulations." His eyes stayed fixed on me, the color rising in his face. "Congratulations for betraying your family, for using what you learned here to benefit my competitors." "This isn't about you," I answered, my voice steady. "It's about my career, my future." "That future exists because I paid for your education," he snapped. "Everything you know came from me. I worked my way through graduate school," I said quietly, "and I paid off my own undergraduate loans." My mother reached over to touch his arm. "Charles, maybe Laura didn't think this through. She can still decline the offer." "I'm not declining," I said. "I start in 2 weeks." Daniel gave a short laugh. Classic Laura, thinking she knows more than Dad. "This isn't about knowing more," I said, heat rising in my chest. "It's about choosing my own path." His hand slammed against the table, making the crystal glasses rattle. "You think you've built something without the Bennett name? You're nothing without this family." Chairs scraped softly as a few relatives shifted in their seats. My father pushed back from the table with sudden force, his chair tipping over behind him. The sound echoed through the dining room. He came around the table quickly, his expression hard. I stayed where I was, my back straight. "I'm done making myself small to protect your pride," I said, my voice clear enough to reach the far end of the table. His fist came fast, catching my left cheekbone and sending me sideways into the wall. The sharp taste of blood filled my mouth. Around us there were gasps, a chair creaking as someone shifted, but no one moved to help. My mother gave a small, tight laugh. "Really? Charles not at dinner?" Daniel's voice was low but satisfied. "Serves you right." I pushed myself upright, pressing a hand against my face, and looked around the table. 40 people, and not one stepped forward. A drop of blood fell onto the white tablecloth, blooming red against the fabric. I turned without a word, walked through the kitchen, and stepped out the side door. The evening air was cool against my skin as I crossed the driveway to my car. No voices called after me. No footsteps followed. In the rearview mirror, my cheek was already swelling. The bruise was nothing compared to the hollow certainty that had settled in my chest. I drove toward the hotel district, the route familiar from business trips. At the desk, I kept my head turned so the clerk wouldn't notice the worst of the damage. Inside the room, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, taking in the swelling and the split lip. The reflection looking back at me was not the one who had walked into the reunion that afternoon. I sat on the edge of the bed, pressing an ice pack to my face, and stared at the silent phone on the nightstand. No calls, no messages. The voices from dinner were still in my ears, the laugh, the jeer, and the silence from everyone else. It was in that quiet, with only the low hum of the air conditioning, that I began to realize the rules of this family had never been meant to change. I sat in the quiet hotel room with the hum of the air conditioner filling the silence. The ice pack had started to lose its chill, but the throbbing in my cheek hadn't eased. I turned my head toward the mirror again. The swelling was worse now, the skin darkening where my father's fist had landed, and my lip was cracked in a way that made even small movements sting. I touched it lightly, feeling the tender edges, then let my hand drop to my lap. My phone lay on the bed beside me, the screen dark. I pressed the side button just to check, though I knew there would be nothing. No calls, no texts. Not from my mother asking if I was all right. Not from Daniel, despite the fact that he'd been just a few feet away when it happened. Not from anyone at that long table who'd seen me walk out. I leaned back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling, and the quiet seemed to draw out old memories whether I wanted them or not. I saw myself at 7 running into the kitchen with a math test marked with a bright red 100 in the corner, only to find my father too busy congratulating Daniel for a goal in his soccer game to look at the paper in my hand. At 12, hearing my mother tell one of her friends that Daniel had inherited the Bennett business sense, while she hoped I would at least marry well. At 16, holding a certificate from a state economics competition, and overhearing my father question whether the judges had lowered the bar because I was a girl. They kept coming one after the other. At 22, bringing home my first serious boyfriend, and watching as my father spent the entire dinner questioning his earning potential while my mother picked apart my cooking and appearance. At 27, learning I'd been passed over for a promotion because my father had called the managing director to suggest I wasn't ready for more responsibility. The pattern had been there all along. I'd just spent years convincing myself that it might change if I tried hard enough. I reached for my laptop from the small desk and opened it without thinking, my fingers moving to the secure folder I had created months earlier. It was full of spreadsheets, emails, and internal reports I had saved during my research into Bennett Financial before I joined Blackwood. At the time, I'd told myself it was just thorough due diligence. Now, scrolling through the files, I couldn't pretend I hadn't sensed I might need them one day. There were inconsistencies in client billing tax records that danced on the edge of legality, and emails discussing ways to sidestep reporting requirements. None of it had been enough to trigger automatic penalties on its own, but taken together, it painted a picture I could no longer ignore. I thought about the employees who had to follow those instructions or risk losing their jobs, the clients who believed every word in the polished reports they were sent. I sat there for a long time, the screen casting a pale light across the room, and the decision began to take shape in my mind. I had kept quiet for years, both at work and at home, to keep the peace. But after tonight, peace wasn't an option that meant anything anymore. On the notepad from the hotel desk, I began writing 3 columns names of people who could help me possible consequences of acting or staying silent and what I wanted the outcome to be if I did go forward. The lists weren't tidy. Some names and notes were circled, others crossed out, but by the time I set the pen down, the plan was there. I would make 3 calls in the morning. The first name on my list was Michael Carr, a senior investigator I'd met at a compliance conference 3 years earlier. We'd stayed in touch, meeting for coffee a few times when he was in the city. I had trusted him then, and I trusted him now. The second was Diana Kelly, a family law attorney known for handling domestic violence cases with a combination of precision and compassion. I had her number from a colleague who'd once needed her help in a difficult divorce. The third was Mark Talley, a journalist who had written a detailed exposé on unethical practices in the banking industry last year. I had been an anonymous source for part of his reporting, and he had earned my respect with the way he handled sensitive information. I closed the laptop and set it on the desk, the decision feeling both heavier and lighter at the same time. I turned off the light and lay in the dark, the cool air brushing across my skin. For the first time in years, I fell asleep quickly without replaying old arguments in my head. When morning came, the swelling in my cheek had settled into a deep, mottled bruise. I took photos from different angles, then wrote down everything that had happened at the reunion step by step. Michael's voice on the other end of the line was calm when he answered, but I could hear the weight in his silence as I told him what I had and what had happened. We agreed to meet late that morning. By 11, I was sitting across from him in a quiet coffee shop, my laptop open to the files. He looked through each one carefully, asking short, pointed questions. When he finally closed the lid, he said, "This is enough to open a case. It won't be quick, but it's solid." I nodded. I had already prepared myself for the long road ahead. My next call was to Diana. Her office was in a converted Victorian house with pale blue siding and tall windows. She listened without interrupting as I described the history in my family, the years of cutting remarks the way the reunion had ended. She took her own set of photographs of my injuries, explained how an emergency restraining order would work, and walked me through the process of filing assault charges. By the time I left, the paperwork was already in motion, and arrangements were being made for the order to be served. In the late afternoon, I met Mark at a small restaurant near the waterfront. He arrived in casual clothes, a departure from the suits I'd seen him in before, and his eyes widened when he saw the bruise on my face. Over lunch, I laid out the larger story, the culture inside my father's company, the evidence I had, and the events of the night before. He took notes asking for clarification where needed and promised to verify everything before moving forward. By the time I returned to my hotel, the sun was beginning to set, casting long stripes of light across the room. The 3 calls had been made, the first steps taken. What would follow was no longer in my control, but for the first time I felt that might be a good thing. By the next morning, the quiet in my hotel room felt different. It wasn't just the absence of calls from my family, it was the stillness that comes when you've made a choice you know you won't undo. I sat at the small desk by the window, the sunlight catching the edges of my laptop, and opened the notes I'd made the night before. 3 names, 3 numbers each with a clear purpose beside it. Michael had already set his team in motion after our meeting yesterday, but he'd told me to keep documenting everything. I spent the first hour of the day organizing the files into labeled folders, adding timestamps to each document and photograph so there would be no question about when they were taken. Every click of the mouse felt like a step further away from the way things used to be. Around mid-morning, I drove to the courthouse district to meet Diana again. The restraining order had been approved, and she handed me a copy before we sat down in her office to review the next steps. The sheriff's department would serve my father within the day. Once he received it, he would be legally barred from coming near me, my home, or my workplace. Keep a record of every attempt at contact, Diana said, sliding a small notebook across the desk toward me. Write down the date, time, and exactly what was said or done. I nodded, tucking it into my bag. From there, I stopped at a quiet diner near the waterfront to meet Mark. He'd brought a small digital recorder and asked if I was comfortable with him using it. I agreed, and we spent nearly 2 hours going over the timeline of events from the evidence I had on the company to the details of the reunion dinner. He listened closely, pausing only to ask for clarification or to have me repeat something for the recording. By the time I left, he had a clear outline of what could become a major feature. That evening, back at the hotel, I turned my phone on for the first time since yesterday. The screen lit up with a list of missed calls: 27 from my mother, 15 from Daniel, and 5 from a number I knew was my father's office line. I didn't listen to any of the voicemails, forwarding them all to Diana instead. She called me an hour later to say they would be added to the case file as potential violations of the restraining order. The next few days followed the same rhythm. I moved between hotels every 2 or 3 nights following Diana's advice to avoid staying in one place too long. Michael sent brief updates when he could. His team was reviewing the financial records and interviewing a few contacts in the industry who had dealt with Bennett Financial. Mark emailed to let me know he was verifying details and reaching out to former employees who might be willing to speak. 10 days after those first calls, the first headline appeared online. It was a short piece on a business news site, Bennett Financial Group, under investigation for alleged client fee manipulation. There were no names mentioned beyond the company, but the description of the allegations was enough for anyone familiar with the industry to know it was serious. I read it twice before closing the browser, my hands resting flat on the desk. 3 days later, the next story broke. This one named my father directly CEO of Bennett Financial facing assault charges in domestic incident. The article didn't go into detail citing privacy in ongoing legal matters, but it confirmed that a restraining order had been filed and that he was due in court. After that, the calls and messages came faster. Some were from extended family members expressing shock. Others were angry, accusing me of airing private matters. A few were from old colleagues who had heard about the investigation and wanted to check in. I didn't answer any of them. Every new message went to Diana. Every unfamiliar number was blocked. By the 3rd week, the situation had shifted again. Michael's update this time was longer. The investigation had expanded to include possible tax violations, and at least 3 former employees had come forward with their own accounts of misconduct. One had provided documents that backed up parts of my evidence. The state's regulatory agency was now involved, and the company's stock price had dropped by nearly 1/3. That same week, Mark called to say he was nearly finished with his article. "Once it's ready, I'll send you the sections that involve you directly," he said. "I want to make sure you're comfortable with what's on the record." His voice was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of how big this story might become. One afternoon, as I was packing to move hotels again, my phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. It was my mother. "We know it was you," she said, her voice tight. "The attorneys told us. You gave them the evidence." I didn't respond, letting the silence stretch. "Are you satisfied now, Laura? You've destroyed everything your father built." "He destroyed it himself," I said evenly. "Years of questionable practices, years of treating people like they didn't matter. This is just the result of that." She drew in a shaky breath. "What do you want, money?" "Is this about your inheritance?" "I want accountability," I told her. For the clients who were misled, for the employees who were threatened, for every time you sat there and let him tear me down. It was one mistake, she said sharply. One moment of losing his temper. It was the result of a lifetime of choices, I answered. And the way you laughed instead of helping me told me everything I needed to know. Her tone shifted lower now. You do realize this hurts you too. No one will hire you with the Bennett name tied to a scandal. Blackwood knows everything I said. I told them before I took the job. There was a pause on the line long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. You planned this. No, I said. He planned it through his own actions. I just stopped protecting him from the consequences. She ended the call without another word. I stood there for a long moment, the phone still in my hand, the quiet of the room settling in again. Outside the window, the streetlights were just starting to flicker on, casting pools of light on the sidewalk below. I set the phone down and went back to my suitcase, the zipper pulling smoothly closed. The road ahead wasn't finished, but the pieces were already moving. By the time I left that room in the morning, there would be no turning back. The morning after my mother's call, I woke to a pale gray light seeping through the hotel curtains. The air felt heavy, the kind of stillness that comes before rain. I made coffee in the small machine by the desk and opened my laptop to check the latest news. 3 new articles had been posted overnight, each building on the last. One detailed the widening scope of the investigation into Bennett Financial, mentioning that federal regulators were now reviewing certain tax filings. Another reported that several long-standing clients had begun withdrawing their portfolios, citing loss of confidence. Michael called mid-morning. His tone was steady, but there was no mistaking the weight of his words. It's moving faster than I expected, he said. The additional witnesses are giving us more than we hoped for. It's clear your father's team is feeling the pressure. He advised me to continue changing hotels for now, and to avoid any location where I might be recognized. I told him I understood, then hung up and began packing again. By the time I checked into my next hotel, the first of the heavier spring rains had started. The sound followed me up to the room, a constant patter against the windows. I set my suitcase by the wall and sat on the bed, letting the noise fill the space while I sorted through the growing pile of documents and notes. Every new piece of information felt like another brick in a wall that could no longer be taken down. Later that afternoon, Mark called to update me on his side of things. I've spoken to 5 former employees now, he said. 3 were willing to go on background. 2 want to remain entirely off the record, but their accounts match your documents almost exactly. He explained that the story was shifting from a profile of one man's misconduct to a broader look at the company's culture. When this runs, he added, it's not just going to be about your father. That night I ordered dinner to the room and left the television on low, not really watching, just needing another voice in the background. My phone lit up with an incoming call from Daniel. I let it go to voicemail, then listened as his voice filled the room. He started with a sharp tone. Do you realize what you've done? But by the end, it was almost pleading. We can fix this if you just stop talking to them. I forwarded it to Diana without replying. The next morning brought a different kind of headline. Bennett Financial CEO temporarily steps down amid ongoing investigation. The article quoted a brief statement from the board, noting the decision was in the best interest of the company and its clients. There was no mention of the assault charges, but the timing made the connection impossible to miss. Around noon, Diana called. The arraignment date is set for next month, she said. We'll be there together. Until then, continue documenting everything and let me know immediately if there's any contact. Her voice softened slightly before she hung up. You're doing exactly what you should be. By the 3rd week, the financial pressure on the company was clear. Industry bulletins reported that Bennett Financial's stock price had dropped 30% since the first story broke. The charity gala my mother hosted each year was canceled without explanation. I learned through one of my cousins that she had stopped going to her country club after a confrontation in the lounge. It was near the end of that week when my phone rang again with an unfamiliar number. This time I let it go to voicemail right away. It was my mother, her tone clipped and low. "Daniel's been trying to reach you. He says the company's bleeding clients every day. This has gone far enough. You've made your point. Call him." I didn't. Instead, I opened my laptop and reread the most recent email from Michael. His team had found discrepancies in quarterly reports going back 5 years. If this holds his message ended, the penalties will be significant. I sat back in the chair, the sound of the rain outside growing steadier, and realized the turning point I'd been waiting for was already here. Mark called again that evening, his voice brisk but measured. "We're going to publish next week. I've confirmed everything we can, and the legal team is satisfied with our sourcing." He paused before adding, "Once it's out there, the public side of this won't slow down. Be ready." I thanked him and hung up, the weight of those words settling in. The rain had eased by then, leaving the air outside damp and cool. I stood at the window looking down at the streetlights reflecting in the wet pavement, knowing that what came next would be louder, faster, and far harder to control. The week after Mark told me his article was nearly ready, the pace of everything shifted. It started with a short message from Michael: "Prepare for escalation. Developments coming fast." He didn't elaborate, but within 2 days I understood what he meant. On Tuesday morning, news outlets began replaying footage of my father being escorted from the company's headquarters by 2 plainclothes officers. The image, his jaw tight, his hands visible but close together as if ready for cuffs, was everywhere by noon. Commentators speculated on what charges might be involved, some tying it to the financial investigation, others mentioning the domestic case. That afternoon, Diana called. "He's been formally charged with misdemeanor assault and multiple financial violations," she said. "Bail conditions are strict. He can't contact you directly or indirectly." She paused before adding, "Given his position, this is a very public moment." I thanked her, though the words felt small compared to the scale of what was happening. Mark called next, his voice steady, but carrying a kind of energy I hadn't heard before. "The arrests give us clearance to run the story sooner. It's been fact-checked twice over. My editor wants it live by Friday morning." He asked if I was still comfortable being named in connection with the assault charges, even if I remained anonymous for the financial portions. I confirmed that I was. Thursday night, I stayed in a hotel near the harbor, the rooms small but quiet, with the faint smell of salt water drifting in through the window. I turned on the news and watched as the anchors read excerpts from the board statement announcing my father's indefinite removal as CEO. They didn't mention who might replace him, only that Daniel was assisting in operational matters. The next morning, Mark's article appeared online at dawn. By 8 o'clock, it was the lead story on several national business sites. It detailed years of aggressive and sometimes deceptive financial practices inside Bennett Financial, supported by interviews with former employees and internal documents. The assault case was mentioned briefly, noting it had triggered scrutiny from both regulators and the press. My phone began to vibrate almost constantly. Some messages were from people I hadn't spoken to in years. Old colleagues, neighbors from Fairfield, even a professor from Northwestern who had followed my career. A few simply said they were thinking of me. Others were sharper, accusing me of betrayal, of turning on my own blood. I didn't answer any of them, forwarding the more aggressive ones to Diana. By the end of the week, the company's situation had worsened. 3 major clients had filed to terminate their contracts. Industry bulletins reported that negotiations were underway for a possible sale. Through a cousin, I heard that my mother had been fielding calls from reporters at her house and that she rarely left her gated community now. On Sunday, Daniel tried again, calling from an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail. "You've made your point," he said. "Dad's out. The company's collapsing. Mom's a wreck. This doesn't need to go any further." His voice softened near the end. "We can still salvage something if you back off now." I listened twice before deleting it. Salvage meant different things to us, and I wasn't interested in his version. 2 days later, Michael sent another update. The tax review had uncovered deliberate misreporting in several filings. "It's enough to trigger penalties and repayment orders," he wrote. Coupled with the client lawsuits, this could end the company outright. That night, I stood by the hotel window looking out over the city lights. The streets below were slick from an earlier rain, the reflections shifting each time a car passed. Somewhere beneath all the noise of the past weeks, a quiet certainty had taken hold. There was no reversing what had begun, and there was no part of me that wanted to. By early summer, the investigation had consumed every headline tied to the Bennett name. My father's legal team tried to negotiate, but the mounting evidence left little room for leverage. 2 more clients filed suit, joining the class action already in motion. The board called an emergency meeting, and within days, the sale of Bennett Financial to a larger corporation was announced. The purchase price was a fraction of what the company had once been worth, with most of the proceeds earmarked for settlements and regulatory penalties. Michael called me the morning the deal was finalized. "It's done," he said simply. "The Bennett era is over." His tone carried a mix of finality and caution. He reminded me that while the legal proceedings against my father would continue, his ability to influence the industry was effectively gone. 2 weeks later, news broke that my mother had filed for divorce after 36 years of marriage. It came out during the hearings that she had known about some of the questionable business practices, but had chosen not to address them. A few reporters camped outside her gated community for days, waiting for a statement that never came. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned she had taken a small condo in a neighboring town and rarely left it except for errands. Daniel's fall was quieter, but just as sharp. His association with my father's misconduct made him toxic in financial circles. After months of unsuccessful applications, he accepted a position at a distant cousin's insurance company in another state. The role was a significant step down in both pay and status, a far cry from the corner office he'd once expected to inherit. The extended family fractured in predictable ways. Some cut off all contact with me, convinced I had destroyed something they considered untouchable. Others reached out quietly, often late at night, to say they understood or to share their own stories of my father's temper. Aunt Evelyn sent a handwritten note a few pages long, admitting she had wanted to speak up for me many times, but had always been afraid of the backlash. During those months, my life settled into a steady rhythm. I moved into a new apartment in a secure building and began my role at Blackwood Financial. Far from being wary of the headlines, my new colleagues treated my actions as proof of my integrity. I was invited to help design a series of enhanced compliance programs work that felt purposeful in a way I hadn't expected. Therapy became another constant. My sessions focused on unraveling the years of conditioning that had kept me seeking approval from people incapable of giving it. There were days when the grief for the family I had wished for was almost as heavy as the anger over the one I had. But there were also days when I left the office and walked home through the city, the evening light catching in the windows, and felt the ease of moving through the world without the weight of their expectations on my shoulders. 6 months after the sale of Bennett Financial, I received an envelope in my mother's handwriting. I almost set it aside unopened, but curiosity got the better of me. The letter began with accusations, but shifted into something closer to reflection. She wrote that she still believed I had gone too far, but admitted she could now see how often my accomplishments had been dismissed. She said she was trying to understand what that must have felt like. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I showed the letter to my therapist and let the words sit for a while. Eventually, I sent a short, polite response, setting clear boundaries while leaving the door open a fraction for the possibility of a healthier connection in the future. One evening in late August, I stood on my balcony as the city lights came on, thinking about the chain of events that had started in that dining room months earlier. The cost had been high, but so had the return. For the first time in my life, the measure of my worth came from me alone. A full year had passed since that night in my parents' dining room, yet some moments from it still felt close enough to touch. The voices, the silence afterward, the way the air shifted when I stood to leave. All of it had become the beginning of something I hadn't seen coming. My life now was quieter, simpler in some ways, and filled with a kind of steadiness I'd never known before. I had settled fully into my apartment, the view from the balcony now as familiar to me as the creak of my old front steps used to be. My days at Blackwood Financial were busy, but they carried a sense of purpose I could feel in my work. The team I worked with respected my judgment, and the compliance program we'd built together was already making a difference. Therapy had helped me sort through the years before all this, the patterns I had accepted as unchangeable the way I had learned to measure myself through someone else's eyes. There were still hard days when an unexpected memory would catch me off guard, but I could move through them now without losing my footing. I hadn't spoken to my father since the court finalized his plea deal. The conditions kept him out of the industry for good, and the fines had taken most of what he had left. My mother's letters came now and then, each one a mix of small talk and attempts to understand. I answered some of them, keeping my replies brief but polite. Daniel never reached out again. The circle of people in my life had grown smaller but warmer. Friends who had stood by me during the worst of it became more like family, the kind you choose rather than inherit. We marked birthdays and quiet milestones, sharing meals in kitchens where laughter came easily. Looking back, the cost of that decision was still clear. Relationships ended, a family name changed in the public eye, the ache of knowing some bonds would never be repaired. But the gains ran deeper, the freedom to stand without apology, the knowledge that I could protect my own dignity, and the quiet certainty that I had acted when it mattered. If there's one thing I carry from it all, it's that we teach people how to treat us by what we allow, what we refuse, and the boundaries we hold when they're tested. It isn't easy, and it isn't without loss, but the life that waits on the other side can be worth it. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect, I hope you found your way through. And if you're standing at that choice now, I hope you remember you deserve to be treated with respect in every room you enter.